In this video we're going to be looking at South Australia's new licence, what you might call a supercar licence, and what they term a UHPV, or ultra high powered vehicle licence. We're going to be looking at what the test for that licence involves. I'm going to offer some suggestions for improvement, but we're going to start with the story behind the licence, and that is this particular car here, Lamborghini Huracan registration Psycho. Here's what happened. The driver of the Lamborghini lost control at a mere 53 kilometers an hour, crashing into this building. The car, as you can see, was badly damaged, but hardly an end-to-end crash. Unfortunately and tragically, this young lady was killed, Sophia Maysmith, back in 2019. And as a result of that, we have the ultra high powered vehicle licence, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this video. Before we get into the analysis, I want to make 3 points. First is that I do strongly support driver education and training to reduce the road toll and accidents as opposed to just endless regulation. Secondly, this licence is a step in the right direction, but there's a lot of questions I have about it, and I think it could be much improved. We're going to go through that in this video. I'd be really interested in your views and comments. And then thirdly, for those that say, "I'll just get on a racetrack, learn how to drive these cars fast on a racetrack," there's no evidence that supports that as being an improvement in road safety. And to further that point, I'm going to go with a quote from our Apollo commander, and what he said was, "The superior pilot uses their superior judgment to avoid situations which require the use of the superior skill." And if you translate that into road terms, that means observation and driver attitude are what's important, not advanced car control skills, because by the time you need those, it's too late, and those skills are hard to teach and very much perishable. So it's better just to not get into the situation in the first place, and mindset is where that comes from. All right, so let's look at what a UHPV actually is. What kind of cars does it apply to? Well, ultra high performance vehicles, essentially it's anything with more than 276 kilowatts per tonne power to weight, or 335 horsepower to 1 tonne, translated it into imperial there. That's all it is. Now, here's an example, the 458, I've done the maths there, so that clearly is a UHPV. The 488, a newer version successor, again, that is definitely UHPV. Huracan, same thing again. But what evidence is there that these are actually the most dangerous cars? So yes, I understand you've got to draw the line somewhere, and it's really hard to write regulation. But if I said to all the car enthusiasts, what vehicle is most likely to spin out of control into bystanders? The answer would be the Ford Mustang. And no offense to Mustang drivers, but if you go to YouTube and search for Mustang fails, there is evidence, right? Now that is well underneath that threshold, but it is a powerful rear drive car. So I think if you're going to look at risk mitigation, that's the sort of thing that you need to look at. And even the humble GR86, less than half, you switch the stability control off on that, and you've got a tail-happy sports car with a powerful Torsen LSD in the rear that will easily swap ends on you. Anyway, Porsche 911 GT3 actually is not an ultra high performance vehicle because it just sneaks underneath the power to weight ratio, whereas the Turbo S is above the power to weight ratio, so it is. And then 2 examples here, both slightly underneath it, but this one's all-wheel drive, that one's rear-wheel drive. I'd argue rear-wheel drive is a greater risk factor than all-wheel drive if we're looking at burnouts and things like that. Now, it's important to note that you can make an ultra high powered vehicle if you modify a vehicle such that it is powerful enough to be 276 kilowatts per tonne. That becomes an ultra high powered vehicle, and then you will need the special licence. Here's the details of the licence. It's effective from 1st December 2024. So if you have a South Australian driving licence and you drive a UHPV after that time, you don't have the U-Class licence, that will be illegal. You're up for fine and demerit points. You'll need a full licence to apply for the U-Class, not a probationary. It's only for the state of South Australia, nowhere else. There's no practical, it's an online test only, and you don't need to own a UHPV to actually take the test. And in fact, that's how I know what's in it. I have a friend who has a South Australian licence. I got him to take the test and we worked through it, so that's what this video is based on. You can drive a UHPV in South Australia on an interstate licence. So if you own a Ferrari and you live in Melbourne, you can legally drive it in South Australia. It's when you have a South Australian licence, that's when you've got to change it to the U-Class. And the law also applies to gift drives, so you can't surprise someone with a Ferrari drive anymore. You've got to get a license, which will kind of ruin the surprise a little bit. And finally, there's an exemption. If you have to drive a UHPV as part of your work, then you can apply for an exemption. All right, so what's actually in the course? Well, give an overview, defining a UHPV, differences, changes, maintenance, and then there's a quiz at the end. You pass that, you get your license. Now, the course talks a lot about AIS's, automated intervention systems, and gives examples here: stability control, blind spot warning, ABS, etc. However, this diagram is wrong according to the legislation, and that's one of the criticism got of the course. It doesn't quite reflect the legislation in some ways. So here's what the law actually says. An AIS, an automated intervention system, is a system which identifies a hazardous condition, like the car's about to spin out of control, for example, and overrides the driver's control of the car. So it gives examples here: ABS, AEB, that's autonomous emergency braking, electronic stability control, and traction control. Now, it also differentiates in the legislation with a warning system, which is again a system or function that identifies a hazardous condition, but this time it just alerts the driver so that the driver can take some action. And it gives examples here of blind spot detection, forward collision warning, and lane departure warning. Now, there's also lane keep assist, very similar. Lane keep assist will actually move the car back into the lane, warning just tells you. And that starts to bring up a grey area here, because AEB actually will warn you before it applies the brakes. So technically that could be a warning system as well as an AIS. And once you start to get into the minutiae of these various electronic systems, which do vary from vehicle to vehicle, different names, it's going to become very difficult for people to figure out what is a warning system which they can disable, like blind spot monitoring, or what is something like AEB which they can't disable in some way. So this needs a bit of work, and it will be confusing for people, I feel. Then we come into driving modes. Now, pretty much every car, and indeed every four-wheel drive now, has driving modes to set the vehicle up for different conditions. And in the case of sports cars, typically there'll be things like the suspension might go from hard to soft. The traction control system might be relaxed in some way for the sportier modes. Stability control can go anywhere from fully on, very tight intervention, to completely off, and anywhere in between really. Electronic differentials, torque vectoring, that could be the center differential or clutch, or the differential between the wheels and the rear axle. The gearbox, that would be the shift points, etc. Engine performance, maybe there's extra power, but often it's just throttle sensitivity. So all of these things can be mapped to give the car different characteristics. And here you see a Ferrari, there's different modes, that is a McLaren, and that is a Lamborghini, so that's pretty normal. Effectively, what the legislation is saying is that if you've got all of these AIS systems which are there to keep you safe, if you disable them in any way, that is going to be a fine of 5,000 Australian dollars and 6 demerit points. All right, so let's delve into that a bit more detailed. What is disabled as far as the legislation is concerned? Well, it's not quite what the dictionary definition of the word disabled is. Disabled, for the purposes of this legislation, remember that's we've got to go to the law here, not the dictionary definition. It means an automated intervention system, which we've covered, and that is not a warning system, is disabled if it is permanently or temporarily destroyed. Well, we'll take that out. Turned off, yes, so if you switch stability control off, that's off. Attenuated. Now, this is the key word here. Attenuated just means reduced. So this is where they're coming from. It's saying if you reduce stability control or something else like that in any way, shape or form, then that is effectively what they mean by disabled, and that is against the law, and that will land you a fine and your demerit points. So here's a sample question from the test. Driving UHP in a sports mode is the same as disabling an intervention system under the Road Traffic Act. And I said I wasn't going to give you the answers, but the answer to that is yes, it is exactly the same. And so switching your Lamborghini from Strada, which is street mode, to either Sport or Corsa, which is track mode, that will become illegal. So here's some example modes which you can see for yourself of different manufacturers. They've all got a base street mode. It's saying don't switch out of that, otherwise that would be illegal. Now, here's a question: what about a wet mode? Because some vehicles, you remember, that Ferrari actually had a wet mode, and Porsche has a wet mode as well. And what that does, the Porsches actually detect when the vehicle is in wet conditions and say, hey, would you like to switch to a wet mode? Now, I don't think that's actually going to be a problem, because it doesn't doesn't really disable or attenuate any of the electronic stability or safety systems. It actually probably tightens them up. But that's me looking at this in detail. I do specialise in this area. Will that be obvious to the driver? Do you think driving along thinking, oh, hang on, no, I've got to keep it in street mode, wet mode? Is that a street mode? Is it not? Should I switch it in? It's just going to create confusion. Electronic systems in cars are really complex and they're hard to describe in legislation. It is a very difficult job to do, but if it's not really clear, it will create confusion. So can you ever drive a UHPV with the AIS disabled? Well, yes, there are some examples where you can do that. The first one is if it's not practical for you to drive with the AIS enabled. So let's say, and this is my interpretation here, that you've got a car, it's playing up with the stability control. So you have to drive it with stability control not enabled because it switches itself off to the mechanic to get it fixed. That is my guess as to an exemption from disabling an AIS. The other example is three parts. The first part is when you did not cause the AIS to be disabled. So let's say you're driving along, your mate leans over, switches off the ESC. Well, that's only one part of it. That's not actually a defence. The second part of it is that you didn't know that was going to be happening. And then the third part of it is that you couldn't ascertain that the car is now in a different mode. And that is where I think people are going to come unhitched, because whenever you switch a car into sports mode, race mode, etc., things change. The gear shift point changes, the exhaust might get louder, and there's always going to be some form of indication on the dash or whatever else to say, hey, you're in sports mode, and some cars even change the whole display as well. So it's probably going to be quite hard to argue you didn't know the car was in some form of sports or race mode. Now, if you're not sure about whether a car is in a race mode or a sports mode, one good tip is to switch it off, wait a couple of seconds, switch it back on, and typically that will reset everything back to all of the aids on, and then you can drive off from there. So here's an example. Now, it's easy to poke fun in legislation, right? But remember, that Porsche 911 GT3 was underneath the power to weight ratio, so you could drive that with ESC off on roads, whereas the Turbo S is just fractionally over, so it would be illegal to drive that with all the aids off. Now, legislation is really hard to write, and I understand the intent behind this. I support the intent, driver education, etc., etc., but I do think that we probably need to do a better job of figuring out where these lines are and looking at risk factors. Now, how will this be contentious? I think there'll be quite a few areas. The first one is that if you've got a Ferrari, you're driving down a road like this, you can't put it in sports mode. And I think that is an unfair restriction on responsible sports car owners who want to enjoy that. And remember, with sports mode, there is still some safety there. I don't agree that you should switch it off entirely and go fanging around these roads. I think that is irresponsible. But I think if you want to put in the car in sports mode and enjoy it, I think you should be allowed to do that. Then the effect on sales. So all of a sudden in South Australia, if you buy a car like this, well, you can't really use some of its modes. I mean, are people going to, probably what they're going to do is buy cars just underneath the limit, and then they can use those modes. And what is a street mode anyway? These electronic systems are so complex, it's open to question. Again, what is disabling? That can be open to question as well. And how will supercar makers respond? If this starts to get widespread, I think what they'll do is they'll just have adaptive modes where you won't switch the car into a sports mode. As you drive, it will detect, and then it will start to switch itself into sports mode, so you haven't done it. And to some extent, cars already do that sort of thing as it is. And, you know, the question again, are supercars actually the ones most at risk here? And essentially the question is, how do you legislate against idiots yet allow responsible owners the freedoms that anyone should expect in a normal society? And hint, my view is it's education, not more red tape. Now, tyres. This is a really important point which has been completely missed in the course. And they talk about semi-slick tyres and performance tyres, etc., and that's kind of good, but I don't really think that's the most important. The important point is tyre age. You've really got to look after tyre age in supercars. And let me explain why. Because old tyres do not grip, especially in the wet. So here's some examples of what I mean. The problem is that supercars tend to be low mileage, and therefore their tyres will age out, not wear out. So here's all the Ferrari 458s I could find for sale in Australia, and here's the kilometres per year: 3,500, less than 1,000, etc., 2,700, 1,500, 4,800. So what we have here, are cars with 12 to 13, cars which are 12 to 13 years old, and they've got an average of 36,000 kilometres on them. Now, a normal car would have an average of probably around 180,000 kilometres, so it would be on its second, third set of tyres by that time. But at 36,000, it is possible that these cars are still on their original tyres, and that those tyres will be 12 to 13 years old. Now, we can argue whether the cut-off age for a tyre is 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, whatever else, right, or even 10 years, but I think 12 years, and it does is too old, even if you've taken care of the tyres as best as you can. So fundamentally, supercar tyres age out, not wear out. So why is tyre age important? Well, essentially the answer is grip. Now, tyres grip in two ways. So you've got your tread, which is mostly for water dispersion and off-road grip, etc. But also the compound, which is the pliability of it, the silica, the rubber, all the other chemicals, etc., which go into it. And that wears out. That hardens over time due to UV exposure, temperature changes, etc., etc. So your tyres do not grip when they're old compared to when they're new. Right? And remember that old tyres, and this has been borne out by many people, they will suddenly lose grip. So if you think, oh, I'll just save it with a bit of oversteer, no. And the AIS won't necessarily help you either, because an AIS cannot rewrite the laws of physics. So if those tyres suddenly snap, they're gone and you with it. Now, here's an example. I'm sure everyone knows who this is. He was driving, or was being driven in a Porsche Carrera GT when he died. And that's the result of the accident. The car caught fire as well. The tyres on that car were 9 years old. Now, I don't know if that was the direct cause of the accident. I've read reports from motoring riders who have said that that particular corner was easy to take at that speed. But if a 9-year-old tyre suddenly lets go, the best driver in the world, and the guy behind the wheel was an experienced and skillful race driver, has got no chance at all. So that's an example. Now, how to check your tyre age. I do have a specialist video on this, but briefly look for the DOT code. That's a 4-digit code. Here's an example. There's DOT, that's the manufacturing details. 3012, in this case, that's 30th week of 2012. And it might just be on the inside of the tyre. So take a look at your tyre age when you buy a car like this, and also trailers like caravans, etc., because they don't tend to do a lot of mileage, and their tyres can age out, not wear out as well. Now, there's some good general advice. They talk about environmental factors, which is good. They talk about the vehicle factors, and they talk about the driver factors, and they bring it all together. Talk a bit about dangerous driving, and then here's the environmental, vehicle and driver. So I think all of that is good, and that could just be in a generalised licence. One point where I do think that they need to clarify a bit further is that they say that UHPVs do not stop quicker. Well, they do. I think if we've got a Camry and we've got a Ferrari 458 with good tyres, you know, at 100 k's an hour, both of them slam the brakes on, the Ferrari's going to stop quicker. Why? Because the tyres are high performance, they're grippier tyres, lower centre of gravity, so many different reasons why that's going to stop quicker. So to say that isn't the case, I think is misleading, and it starts to destroy credibility. I think you should say something like, yes, the UHPV can stop quicker, but only if it is on a smooth surface and the tyres are good, etc. And in any case, it's not much different, so don't rely on it. So it's a fine line to tread, but I think just to say it doesn't stop quicker is false. They do make the point that the brakes are for repeated application, and that is true, but that's not really, I think, so relevant. So my suggestions for changing this course: the first one is add tyre age, really important. Second one, talk about tyre performance when cold. I think that should be brought out more. I'd suggest that people should be leaving the suspension on soft, because certainly sometimes even on racetracks you're actually going to get a quicker lap time with the suspension not on the hardest setting, one down, if the racetrack's a bit bumpy, let alone on public roads. And stress that, you know, yeah, UHPVs are great on racetracks, that's what they're designed for, but explain a bit more about why that makes them not so good on public roads. And stress that AISs cannot rewrite the laws of physics. Just because you've put stability control on doesn't mean to say you can go around a corner at whatever speed you like. It simply doesn't work that way. And also say that, look, the AIS changes, they're only talking about powertrain mode. So I think that needs to be clarified up a little bit because it will be confusing for people. And I would also change to allow any driving mode except off. I don't think that there's a reason to be driving a supercar on the road with everything completely switched off. Sports mode, yes, but the only reason you want off is if you want to drift or hang the back out, and that's what you should be doing on a private road. And I think a really important point here is reduced visibility. So when you are in a sports car, you are down lower, you can't see as much, your view is much more obstructed, you've often got tiny little wing mirrors, the interior mirror is almost non-existent sometimes, so you are much restricted, and that needs to be brought out. I think that's important. And even things like the turning circle being larger as well. You go to do a 3-point turn, you can't because you're surprised, and then traffic is oncoming, so I'd point that out as well. So I'm interested to see what you guys think about this law. Thank you for watching, and please use the comments to give us your opinion.